Now, before I start this video, I want a lot of you to keep in mind that I'm going to be giving a simple and understandable comparison of these complex neural processes later on in the video. So if you don't understand something near the beginning, don't just click off and give up, because I think that my comparison does explain adequately what is going on in the neural pathways. So keep that in mind while you're watching it. Hey everybody, so today I'm going to be making a video where we briefly go over Hebbian plasticity, anti-hebbian plasticity, or LTP and LTD, and I'm going to be trying to put this in a very simplified format so that people who are not very advanced in neuroscience or knowledge of intracellular neurobiology can understand why it is a bad idea to introduce more noise to somebody who already has an hyperactive auditory pathway. Now, the first thing I'd like to talk about today is Hebbian theory. Now, according to Hebbian theory, neurons, which are the messengers of the brain, increase or decrease the strength of their connections based on how they activate in relation to each other. Now, if you take a look at this diagram right here, you can see that this is the action potential. Now, the action potential is basically the electric current that travels from one neuron to the next one. Now, in Hebbian plasticity, if there's a very frequent and high-intensity activation of the presynaptic neuron, which is the one that goes before the connection or the synapse, compared to the one that is after the connection or the postsynaptic neuron. So, for example, in this diagram, you can see that the nerve signal is going down. It passes to the next neuron at the synapse right here, and then this neuron fires another action potential, and this signal goes down to the next neuron. Now, this is basically how neurons usually fire their signals. So that's one after the other. You can imagine it exactly to be like an electric circuit. Yeah, like for example, the electricity just flows down the wires, so to speak, in a linear fashion, for example. Of course, it's much more complex usually than just a linear fashion, but to simplify it, you can remember it that way. Now, when this type of activation happens, or when the action potential travels down to the next neuron in the pathway, the neuron interprets it that this connection is important. And what it actually does is that it strengthens this connection. You can imagine it like, for example, a worker who is constantly monitoring how strong the electrical current is in some wires. And if he sees that the electric current is being sent down these wires really often and really much, then what he does is he pulls a lever that basically increases the strength of this wire, for example. Now, to go really quickly over anti-hebbian plasticity, it's when the exact opposite happens. It's when the postsynaptic neuron fires actually before the presynaptic neuron. And this is actually, according to our body's default, not normal. So this actually signals to the neuron that this connection is not important. Because technically, for most processes like memory, for example, repetition and rehearsal of material causes these neural pathways to activate more frequently in a linear and coordinated manner. And the body interprets this that these connections are important, and or the connections between the neurons are important. And of course, as we all know, repetition can actually improve memory even further. So that's the same thing that's happening in the memory. And a lack of activation or a weak activation, for example, can actually cause these connections to disintegrate because the body interprets it that they're not that important. Now, tinnitus, or ringing in the ears, is the hyperactivity of neurons specifically in the dorsal cochlear nucleus and other parts of the auditory pathway. Now, to explain it simply for people, when sound enters the ear, it does not immediately go to the brain. It goes through a complex pathway each part of which is very important for certain things. You can just imagine the DCN, or the dorsal cochlear nucleus, as a very important processing center of the auditory signal, which then gets passed to the brain. You can imagine the DCN to be like a sorting center for Amazon, for example, the brain being your house and the package being the nerve signal, for example. Unfortunately, or fortunately for memory, for example, neurons have a tendency to reinforce their own connections. I'm not going to go into the details on that, but this is very useful for memory, for example, and this is why we don't forget everything immediately. But in the context of the DCN, unfortunately, this mechanism actually, or this reinforcing mechanism, actually causes these excitatory connections, or the action potentials, which there's too many of, to constantly fire over and over again without any input. Now, over time, due to anti-hebbian plasticity, for example, after a very long time, a lack of input can eventually lead to these connections dissolving because the brain realizes that they're not important. You can actually imagine hyperactivity according to the example that I gave, that the nerve signal is, for example, the package that you ordered from Amazon, and Amazon itself, or their warehouses, being the ear, and this package goes to the sorting center, which is the dorsal cochlear nucleus of the brainstem. And this package is then processed and sent to your house, which is the auditory cortex in the brain itself. Now, hyperactivity would, for example, be something like the workers of this sorting center mislabeling packages to be sent to your house instead of just the package that you want. So your house, which you can imagine in my comparison to be the brain, is receiving way too many packages from this sorting center due to some error in the system. The packages being, for example, the nerve signals. Now, anti-hebbian plasticity, which is lack of input, or, for example, the postsynaptic neuron firing before the presynaptic neuron, you can imagine it in my Amazon example to be yourself calling the Amazon sorting center and telling them, like, what the hell, I'm receiving too many packages that are not mine. Can you guys, like, chill out and stop sending them? And you can imagine hebbian plasticity, or the strengthening of these synaptic connections. You can imagine it like the Amazon warehouse calling the sorting center and saying, oh my god, this guy is receiving so many packages, he obviously must be like a really important guy, we gotta send him more and more packages, basically. Now, to move on to the more important stuff in this video, the degree of neural hyperactivity is very different among different people due to multiple factors. This includes the amount of excitatory neurotransmitters, and the excitatory neurotransmitters, you can imagine them to be like the phone calls that the Amazon warehouse makes to the sorting center, and also the number of AMPA receptors. You can imagine AMPA receptors to be like the workers at the sorting center who receive these calls from the Amazon warehouse. Now, people with more hyperactivity, they actually are more susceptible to this worsening, because people who have more hyperactivity have more of these receptors. AKA the sorting center, the Amazon sorting center, has more workers waiting next to phones, waiting for instructions from the Amazon warehouse, for example. And people who have lower neural hyperactivity, you can imagine it like there being less workers waiting next to the phones in the Amazon sorting center, waiting for instructions from the Amazon warehouse, for example. Now, obviously, if you have more of these receptors on your postsynaptic neuron, which would mean more people or more workers in the sorting center waiting next to their phones, obviously the chance of these instructions being passed on and these workers increasing the amount of packages that are being sent to your house, or the nerve signals that pass to the next neuron, eventually reaching your brain, the more you have of these receptors, or the more workers you have next to your phone, the more the chance that these workers will be increased even more and more and more. So there's a higher chance that these receptors will increase in their amount based on the amount of instructions that they get from the presynaptic neuron, or the workers of the Amazon sorting center understanding like, oh my god, we're getting so many instructions from the warehouse and we don't have enough workers sitting next to the phones. So we gotta hire more workers to respond to the phones faster. And you can actually imagine this like the nerve cells increasing their hyperactivity. The more signals, the more rapid signals you get, ergo, for example, listening to noise, the more the body interprets these signals as being important, and the more receptors it adds to the body. So to go over my example again, the Amazon warehouse is sending packages to the sorting center, and the sorting center already has too many workers waiting next to their phones. So even if some of these instructions from the Amazon warehouse are incorrect, or there's too many of them, the workers on the phones who are getting these instructions to send packages to your house are going to send them to your house anyways, even though these packages are not yours. They're not, they're mislabeled. And the manager, you can imagine it as the nerve cell itself, the manager sees that there's a lot of phone calls coming from the Amazon warehouse, and he's like, dude, we can't handle all these phone calls. We got to increase the amount of workers. So the amount of workers who are sitting next to their phones getting these calls from the Amazon warehouse just keeps increasing exponentially more and more and more. So basically what you're doing, if you're listening to audio, if you already have a very high level of hyperactivity, if you're listening to audio, you are basically increasing the amount of instructions to send the packages to your house from the Amazon warehouse, which will then lead for more workers to be hired to receive even more of these incorrect phone calls, which then will result in more packages that are not supposed to be yours sent to your house. It's very important to understand that people who already have a high level of hyperactivity, or too many of these receptors, or Amazon workers, for example, sitting next to their phones waiting for instructions from the warehouse, you cannot force more sound onto somebody who is already very hyperactive, because more sound means that there's going to be more action potentials or more signals from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron, or more instructions being sent from the Amazon warehouse to the workers in the sorting center. And if these signals are strong enough, basically the neuron is going to increase the amount of these receptors on the cell membrane. Or the manager in the sorting center is going to see that there's a lot of instructions coming from the warehouse, and he's going to increase the amount of workers sitting next to their phones or responding to these instructions, which will then increase the hyperactivity even further. So what you need to understand is that what is the best possible thing to do if you have already very high hyperactivity? Well, the best thing to do is to avoid this stimulation. If you avoid this stimulation for long enough, your nerve cells will react in a way that is going to see that these connections are not as important, and it's going to dissolve them permanently. But if you continue these stimulations or intense stimulations with noise, then your nerve cell is not going to understand that these connections are not important and need to be dissolved, or the receptors, the AMPA receptors, need to be dissolved permanently. So to all the people out there who think that putting your loved one or your family member into a more noisy environment is going to help them, actually it's not. And you need to wait for these receptors to either dissolve on their own or to be dissolved by an artificial postsynaptic spike, like, for example, the Susan Shore tinnitus device. And you can imagine the Susan Shore tinnitus device being like you calling the sorting center and telling them to calm the hell down because you're receiving too many packages that aren't yours. So yeah, don't force yourself into noise if you are already in a very hyperactive state. Now, it's okay for people with a lower hyperactive state to introduce themselves to noise a little bit, because the amount of AMPA receptors that they have is much less, and these instructions from the Amazon warehouse will not be passed on to, or passed on further, which will eventually lead your house to getting way more packages than you need. That doesn't mean that people who have a lower amount of hyperactivity are 100% safe. It just means that the chance of them worsening is much less than people who are already in a state of heightened neural hyperactivity, basically. So yeah, basically, don't force your family members into a noisy environment, and don't force yourself into a noisy environment unless enough time actually passes for these AMPA receptors to be removed with time, or for the condition to stabilize, basically. That's about it for today.